the Freedom Riders. A lot of them came from Los Angeles, apparently. James Farmer, newly appointed National Director of CORE, agreed with King and the SCLC that the Kennedys had to be prevented from sweeping their civil rights election promises under the carpet of continual Cold War crises. He proposed a freedom ride through the Deep South to test a recent Supreme Court decision that extended non-discrimination in interstate travel on trains, buses, and airplanes to include terminals and waiting rooms as well. In a situation where the law was now crystal clear but its application was bound to elicit violent reactions in hardcore segregationist states, Farmer calculated that Washington would be forced to act. The ride would help sustain the energy of the student movement while redirecting it to a higher level of contestation involving governors and federal officials, as well as mayors and local business. Everything, however, depended on the volunteers' willingness to risk their lives by riding into the heart of segregationist darkness. The 13 riders, led by James Farmer, left Washington on May 4 in two groups, one on Trailways and another on Greyhound, just as in 1947. Unlike the Journey of Reconciliation, however, which ventured no further south than North Carolina, their tickets were stamped New Orleans via the Klan strongholds of Alabama and Mississippi. Outside of Anniston, Alabama, the Greyhound bus, its tires slashed, was forced off the road and then firebombed by pursuant Klansmen. According to Raymond Arsenault's history, several members of the mob had pressed against the door, screaming, "Burn them alive! Fry the goddamn inwards!" And the Freedom Riders had been all but doomed until an exploding fuel tank convinced the mob that the whole bus was about to explode, and as the attackers retreated, the passengers crawled out of the bus only to be attacked with pipes and clubs. Meanwhile, the Trailways contingent, also badly beaten in Anniston, found themselves headed toward Birmingham with some Klansmen as fellow passengers. In Alabama's largest city, the police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, met with the Klan to choreograph a welcome for the Freedom Riders. The police and the Klan going hand in hand, just like they do nowadays, with the Proud Boys and every other fucking neo-fascist group in the goddamn neo-Confederate States of America. Bull Connor gave Imperial Wizard Bobby Shelton and his carefully selected thugs 15 minutes to set an example that would deter all future attempts at integration. Through a Klan informant, the FBI knew all about Connor's sinister plan, but it made no effort to warn CORE or any of the local civil rights leadership. Nor did J. Edgar Hoover bother to inform anyone in the Justice Department. The massacre that followed on Mother's Day 1961 was such an enthusiastic affair that Klansmen armed with lead pipes and baseball bats hospitalized not only the riders but also news reporters, black bystanders, and mistakenly even one of their own number. President Kennedy, a Cold Warrior first and foremost, who was reportedly furious at James Farmer, not Bull Connor or Alabama Governor John Patterson, for embarrassing the administration on the eve of his Vienna summit with Khrushchev. "Can't you get your goddamn friends off those buses?" he shouted at his White House civil rights advisor. "Stop them!" That's neoliberalism in a nutshell, ain't it? Huddled together at the parsonage of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, the embattled headquarters of the Birmingham Freedom Movement, the CORE group, vowed not to surrender and instead went downtown to catch the next Greyhound to Montgomery. But Governor Patterson stopped the departure, going on television to warn that he was unable to protect the Freedom Riders from Klan ambushes along the route. Bobby Kennedy finally convinced the group to fly to New Orleans, but they ended up spending the night on the plane at the Birmingham airport, as one anonymous bomb threat after another was called in. This is all in this book about Los Angeles because there's a huge number of youth from Los Angeles that were on these buses. Student reinforcements, she assured Farmer, were coming from Nashville under the leadership of John Lewis, and were ready to sacrifice their lives if necessary. Although their first attempt to board buses in Birmingham was thwarted when Connor jailed and then deported them across the state line to Tennessee, the kamikaze contingent soon regrouped and clandestinely returned to Birmingham. One of their members was 20 years old Susan Herman, a white exchange student at Fisk University in Nashville, from Whittier College in Los Angeles. Her family lived in Mar Vista, just east of Venice Beach. After much arm wrestling between Alabama officials and the Justice Department, they were allowed to board a Greyhound for Montgomery, the state capital. Then another ambush awaited them. With the Klan again given 10 minutes of police non-interference to commit maximum mayhem, just like the LAPD allowed the IDF soldiers and Zionist thugs to beat up UCLA students in the middle of their campus. The Klan was given another 10 minutes of police non-interference to commit maximum mayhem. When Bobby Kennedy's representative at the scene, Assistant Attorney General John Segelthaler, attempted to rescue Herman and another young woman from the mob, he was beaten unconscious with a pipe. In an escalation that took Washington by surprise, the city and state police then followed several thousand whites to besiege the injured Freedom Riders and their local supporters in the sanctuary of Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church. A hastily cobbled together task force of federal marshals sent to protect the church was attacked and came close to being overrun. Before Governor Patterson, aware that the army was on alert at Fort Benning, finally sent in troopers to quell the mob, he had cut a cynical deal with the Justice Department. The bus carrying the Corps and SNCC volunteers would be escorted safely through Alabama and then be handed over to Mississippi State Police. Fucking Confederates. All right. Oh, here's some more information about CORE. One example of CORE's popular charisma was in the San Fernando Valley, where two Berkeley students, Ken Cloak and Pat Kovner, a Freedom Rider in August, had spent the beginning of the summer break assembling a surprisingly large and active chapter, many of them grads from Reseda High School, where Cloak had been student body president 2 years earlier. At the beginning of June, CORE opened up an office around the corner from LA City College on Melrose Avenue. Ed Blankenheim, a white Marine veteran turned pacifist, who had been on the Greyhound bus that was burned outside of Anniston, was sent by Farmer to interview volunteers and plan an LA origin freedom ride that would proceed by train to New Orleans, then by bus to Jackson. But LA CORE was also debating how to respond to the area's own simmering racial crisis. One provocation quickly followed another. 3 of the black youth arrested during the Memorial Day incident in Griffith Park, which Chief Parker blamed on the publicity coming out of the South in connection with the Freedom Rides, were indicted for quote-unquote lynching and assault with intent to commit murder, while white youth who pelted sheriff deputies with sand-packed beer cans during a far larger riot at Zuma Beach over spring break a few weeks later were charged with no more than misdemeanors. Yeah, fucking figures. Here's an interesting bit about LA students. Those who immediately walked the walk were 11 LA CORE members who arrived in Jackson by train from New Orleans on June 25th and quickly vanished into Parchman's maximum security wing of jail. They included 4 LACC students, a 17-year-old from Fremont High School, 2 artists, a housewife, the professional boxer John Rogers and his wife, and a teacher at a parochial school near Watts. I would like to think that at some point the professional boxer John Rogers got a few licks in with the KKK before he went to jail. The last, Mary Hamilton, became an important leader of CORE in the South, taking on dangerous assignments in Gadsden, Alabama, and Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, as well as winning a landmark Supreme Court case stemming from her refusal to answer an Alabama judge unless he addressed her as Miss. The second LA contingent, 7 young black activists, with 3 others, arrived in Jackson by train on July 9th to share cells with riders from Montgomery, along with teenage members of the Jackson Nonviolent Movement, arrested the same day. One of the LA crew, 29-year-old Rowena Rand, would go on to lead the large but tempestuous CORE chapter in Washington, D.C. The third LA Freedom Ride, involving 4 blacks and 8 whites, was sponsored by the religious flagship of the Central Avenue corridor, the Second Baptist Church. Dr. Raymond Henderson had been on the pulpit of his famed church, long associated with the NAACP since 1940, and his passionate endorsement of the rides was a snub to Roy Wilkins, the organization's executive secretary. Oh, this is interesting. The Jackson-bound riders included two middle-aged Los Angeles lawyers, Jean Kidwell Pestana and Rose Shore Rosenberg, whose leadership in the left-wing National Lawyers Guild and travels in the Socialist Bloc were widely publicized by Mississippi's mini KGB, the State Sovereignty Commission, with the help of McCarthyism's poet laureate, the conservative columnist Fulton Lewis Jr. Fascinating. The notion, quote, the notion that the Freedom Rides were part of a communist plot, explains Raymond Arsenault, first emerged in Alabama in mid-May when Bull Connor, Attorney General MacDonald Gallion, and others played upon Cold War suspicions of a grand conspiracy to subvert the Southern way of life. A lot of people don't realize there were a ton of communists that fought for the Union during the Civil War that had been part of the original 48 revolution in Prussia right after Marx and Engels released the Communist Manifesto. FYI, look up August Willich. He led the entirety of the Army of the Ohio to some of the most heroic Union victories of the Civil War. Later, after the focus of the rides moved to Jackson, the communist linkage became the stock in trade of Mississippi politicians and editors attempting to discredit the campaign. This fusion of McCarthyism and white supremacy was serendipity for hardline Dixiecrats, while allowing groups like the John Birch Society to exploit Northern racism. Yeah, fucking figures. Ooh, Santa Monica Corps, led by Robert and Helen Singleton, dispatched a contingent that arrived in Jackson on June 25th. 9 of the 15 LA riders were, like Bob Singleton, UCLA students, and they included Michael Grubbs, the nephew of famed historian John Hope Franklin. Wow. In early August, Birmingham's Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth came to L.A. In 1956, he had crawled out of the rubble after his parsonage was bombed by the Klan. More recently, he had saved Freedom Riders from the Klan, and he addressed almost 1,000 people at Will Rogers Park in Watts. Then, in a demonstration of Southern stamina, marched several hundred of them nearly 10 miles to the Federal Building downtown to demand protection for civil rights workers in the Deep South. The fifth and last LA Freedom Ride, with 7 white and 4 black participants, had set out for Jackson via Houston and New Orleans. Once again, the composition of the group reflected the important, even central role played by the Red Diaper Babies of Los Angeles Corps. Bev Ratcliffe and Ellen Kleinman, already mentioned, were ISU activists, while Stephen Sanfield, the night manager at the famed Larry Edmunds bookshop in Hollywood, and artist Charles Berard, were close to the Southern California CP, Communist Party. Steve McNichols, also mentioned earlier, was with UCLA and Santa Monica's Corps. Adding a different ideological tincture, Robert Farrell and his close friend Ronald Labostri represented the civil rights current among LA's black Catholics. Marjorie Dunson, slightly older, was a Jamaican citizen. Southern California abolitionists were ready to finish what Sherman and Grant started, reinvade the South to set folks free. Wow. There was a contingent from San Fernando Valley on one of the last of the Freedom Rides. It became the subject of a hair-raising plebiscite by their fellow inmates who decided by one vote not to beat them up. The 4 white male Freedom Riders, however, were greeted as fucking N-word lovers and spent 2 terrible days as punching bags for the sadistic racists and anti-Semites in their part of the jail. McNichols from UCLA suffered the worst beatings, which permanently damaged his spine. Wow. These people were not afraid to put their money where their mouth was, put their bodies on the line for the cause. I only hope they got a few licks in. Interesting. In 1958, after a number of guards were injured in a riot at the Duell Youth Prison east of Oakland, authorities took the unprecedented step of transferring the identified instigators